Okay, so Chevra, in my line of work, we get these are very practical issues that can come up if a person wishes to change their tzedakah pledge from one charity to another, or let's say from one cause to another, sometimes one cause within the same institution. What are the parameters? It seems that the poskim all agree that once you've made a pledge, you can't rescind the pledge and not honor the pledge. It's legally binding according to halacha, and it's like it has the status of hektish, and you have to honor that pledge. And even a hataras nedarim, according to many poskim, does not work when you make a pledge to tzedakah. There are two reasons for it. Number one, when you make a pledge to do a mitzvah, hataras nedarim, according to many poskim, doesn't work. And number two, it's especially true when you make a public pledge, because a public neder cannot be annulled through hataras nedarim. It's very, very complicated to do that, and a person would have to have mitigating, really, truly mitigating circumstances for that to be permissible. Now, the research for this sugya started in our daily morning Choshen Mishpat Shiur. We learn financial halacha every morning from Monday through Friday at 6:10 a.m. We've been doing that for several years, really even started before COVID, but it really took off during COVID. We finished an entire sefer called Imre Yaakov, which went through the main sections of Choshen Mishpat that pertain to a balabas, not the sections of Choshen Mishpat that pertain to a dayanim or to edim. And then we migrated to other subjects. We also did the laws of nachala, how to draft a will according to halacha that will comply with the halachic requirements. And now we're into Hilchos Tzedaka. Now, Hilchos Tzedaka is a Yoredeya sugya, but it still involves financial halacha. So it certainly fits within the rubric of what we're trying to accomplish. And it's really especially important to be aware of these halachot that revolve around one's finances, because when it comes to money, there are many ways of rationalizing. Chazal say that, in other words, they say that when it comes to a person's finances, there are all means of tzedaki, which means like excuses or rationalizations and arguments for a person to be able to hold on to his money, despite the fact that he may be obligated. And this has many applications, including an application as far as pledges to tzedakah. Now, certainly, and this is a separate sugya share that I think I'd like to save to another time, what is the level of obligation once you've made a pledge? How long do you have to pay off the pledge? And the Shulchan Aruch is quite explicit. Once you've made a pledge, you only become liable to pay the pledge when the need is clear and present. In other words, if I make a pledge to give tzedakah to aniyim, and there are no aniyim available, then I'm not obligated to make good on that pledge until I find aniyim. But I do have an obligation to try and find aniyim, but until I find them, I'm not in violation of my neder. What if I pledge to give to a certain cause? Let's say it's a building fund, and at what point do I become chayiv to pay? So the Shulchan Aruch says, as soon as the gabbai of that fund asks you for the money, payment is due in full. There's no such thing unless you make explicit arrangements in advance of the pledge, let's say to pay it off over 10 years or to pay it off over X amount of time. A person can't say, yes, I made the pledge and it's now, it was a public announcement, but I've decided that I'm going to hold off paying that pledge until it's convenient for me. That is a violation of the Shulchan Aruch. What we're going to discuss tonight is the origin, starting from the Gemara, as to under what circumstances would a person be permitted to change the pledge. He doesn't want to shirk his responsibility to give tzedakah, but changed circumstances demand in his own mind that he change the tzedakah from cause A to cause B. And any number of things may have happened. And a lot of times it has to do with broigus. Okay? So I made a pledge to tzedakah A, and I got broigus with that institution or that charity. So I still plan to give the money, but I don't want to give it to that tzedakah. I want to give it to another tzedakah. Under what conditions would I be permitted to do that? It's not that clear cut. And so we're going to take a look at our sugya tonight. I'm just bringing up my screen on for the people who are going to be watching this later. And the sugya really begins in Maseches Erechin. And it's actually a very vague statement in the Gemara that can be interpreted in more than one way. It's in source number 1. Amar, Simi, are the letters large enough? Is it good? I tried to make it a little bit bigger, but I'm sorry if it's not big enough. Amar, Swad? No, I didn't. No, because chas v'sholom, I didn't mean to. I didn't mean to embarrass you in any way. But you had mentioned once that. Okay. Amar Rabba bar Avuha, Amar Rav. HaOmer, we're all in the same boat, Simi. So trust me. Amar Rabba bar Avuha, Amar Rav. HaOmer selazu litzdaka mutar l'shanota. If a person says this coin is for tzedakah, it is permitted to change it. It is permitted to change it. Now, what does it mean it is permitted to change it? Rashi says, now look at Rashi very carefully. Litzrachav ula'achar zeman yishalem. What does that mean? You can use it for personal use. So I take out a $20 bill out of my pocket and I say, I'm going to give this for tzedakah. In the meantime, I get home and my wife says, we need to pay the housekeeper. Do you have any cash on you? So I say, I just got this $20 bill, but I already pledged tzedakah. She says, don't worry. We'll get, when we go to the bank later today, you'll get another 20, you'll give it to tzedakah. Rashi, that's what Rashi is saying. Rashi is saying that that's what the Gemara means when it says you're allowed to change the money for your personal needs and then replenish it with different cash. Yeah, mutar l'shanota. Yeah, you're allowed to change the money. And even if it means delaying paying the pledge because you got to go to the bank and maybe you won't get to it until tomorrow. But as long as you eventually pay back the tzedakah, what you borrowed from the tzedakah. And that's true, bein la'atzmo, bein la'acher, whether you need the money for yourself or whether you need to give it to somebody else, bein omar alai, bein omar harezu. And it also makes no difference in the nature of the neder, whether you made the pledge to, I'm going to give $20 to tzedakah, or whether you said this $20 bill is tzedakah. Even in the latter case, you're allowed to borrow the $20 and then replenish it with a different $20 bill. Yes, Harold. A sheep is different. We're dealing with currency now. We're dealing with currency. So you're right. When you're makdish an animal, and then there's different types of hektish. There's kedushas haguf, there's kedushas damim. But it's certainly, if you're makdish an object and you say this is for a korban, there's no question that you can't remove the kedusha. Yeah. So right. Tanu Rabbana. Sela zu litzdaka. Ad shelo ba'asa liyad gabai mutar l'shanota. Right? If a person says this coin is for tzedakah, before it gets into the hands of the gabai tzedakah, the guy who collects the money that people give for tzedakah, a person is allowed to change it. But mishaba'ata liyad gabai asur l'shanota. Once it gets into the hands of the gabai, you're not allowed to change it. Now here's the question: what does changing it mean in the second statement? This is where we get into a controversy, two opinions that are brought down in Tosfos. So take a look at Tosfos on this Gemara. Ad shelo ba'asa liyad gabai mutar l'shanosa. Before it gets into the hands of the gabai, you're allowed to change it. Rabbeinu Baruch Piresh mutar l'shanota mamash lemitzvah acheret. Not only are you allowed to borrow the money, but you're allowed to change it for a different mitzvah. So if I was planning to pledge to give this money for, let's say, a poor person, and I decide instead to build a mikveh with it, I'm allowed to do that as well. V'im nodar adam selo litzdaka la'aniyim yachol la'asot mimenu mitzvah acheret kol kama delo atai liyad gabai. And therefore, if I pledged originally that this $20 bill was going to be for aniyim, for the poor, and then I changed my mind, as long as it hasn't reached the hands of the gabai, then I can say I'm going to use it for building a mikvah, or I'm going to be using it to do another mitzvah. Unclear what the scope of those mitzvot. Can I use it to buy a lulav and estrog? Right? Not clear. But I can certainly change it to a different, what we would call a charitable cause. That certainly is what Tosfos is saying. So but it can't yet have reached the hands of the place. So once I've given it to the gabai and I say this is for aniyim, I cannot ask for it back. It's left my possession, and I no longer can control what can be done with those funds. How can you justify it? Because it's already come, so to speak, it's already come into the hands of the gabai. I think the answer probably is because you're not changing it in any way for a different purpose. You're just exchanging money for money. Let's say I need 2 5s for a 10, right? So I can put a $10 bill and take out 2 5s. I haven't changed the receivables of the charity. So that would be the argument. It's not as bad as what we're talking about over here. Now, Tosfos is bothered by this explanation of Rabbeinu Baruch, and he says of a lishna lishanota lo mashma ken. But he says the language that the Gemara uses, which was exactly the same as the previous line, does not seem to conform to the way Rabbeinu Baruch is explaining this halacha. Kach matzati kosav b'tosus Rav Moshe me'avira michtivat achiv upiresh lo mashma l'shanota l'mitzvah acheret. And he says, and I'm citing now, he says, from a different Tosafist who cites his brother and says that I don't go along with Rabbeinu Baruch. Why? It doesn't mean that you're allowed to change it to a different mitzvah. Because previously when the Gemara said mutar l'shanota, it didn't mean changing the tzedaka, but rather using it for personal use temporarily until you get more cash and you can just replenish it. But it sounds like from the previous line of the Gemara that the only dispensation that you have is only to use the $20 bill for personal use, but you still have to fulfill your neder to give $20 to aniyim, and you can't change your pledge from one cause to a different cause. Hilkach nira loimar, we're skipping a little bit. Dililavota ka'amar, v'lishanota vaday asur. And therefore, Tosfos's conclusion is that you're not allowed, it's usur to change once you've made a pledge to give the $20 to aniyim, even before it comes to the hand of the gabai, you're not permitted to change the usage of the money for another charity. And therefore, all the Gemara means is that once you've given the $20 bill to the gabai tzedaka, or maybe even in the pushka, and then your wife calls you on your cell and says, do you have any cash on you? Are you coming home from shul now? You have any cash on you? You can't now reach into the pushka or ask the gabai tzedaka for the $20 back. You've relinquished it. It's not yours anymore. Okay, so we have a machlokes in Tosfos. According to the first opinion of Tosfos, are you allowed to change committed tzedakah funds from one cause to another, from one mitzvah to another? Yes. According to the second opinion, it's usur. It's a very significant machlokes that begins in this Tosfos. Well, every check is an IOU in a sense. When I write a check to tzedakah, it's basically telling the guy, take this note, take it to my bank and take my money. So it really is, in a sense, a promissory note. And the question is, can you cancel a promissory note? That seems to be even worse than a pledge because you've committed yourself. I guess your question is, once I've written the check and I want to now change it from one cause to another, according to the first answer of Tosfos, is that having already reached the hands of the Gabbai or not? Interesting question. Not sure what the answer is. Okay. Yeah, he says that you're allowed to use it for personal use. That's what mutar l'shanosa means. Just like the previous line, mutar l'shanosa means you can use it temporarily for previous use, for personal use. You can borrow it until, yeah, to pay the housekeeper. Yeah. Yeah. That's how he learns. Yeah.
Like in the Hilchos Basic Knesset, you have the concept of Malan Kodesh. So are there different levels of charity? In other words, could you?
Good. Well, I'm hoping to get to there tonight. We're going to talk about whether you can change from any cause to any other cause, or whether it has to be sort of an upgrade in the cause. Okay. Now, and that's not so clear. What qualifies as an upgrade? What qualifies as a downgrade? What if for you building a mikveh is more important than supporting the poor? And what if the situation where you're, in your unique situation, building a mikveh is more important than supporting the poor because there's no mikveh in the city, right? And for another situation where there already is a mikveh, just that it's a dilapidated mikveh, maybe the cause of aniyim takes priority. So we're going to see, Rav Fisher is going to try to maneuver through that. We'll see in a minute. So the Ktsos HaChoshen is our next stop along this journey. And he writes, quoting from the Ridbaz and other tshuvas, he says, Nistapku b'noder li ploni ani im yachol l'shanosa la'ani acher ayin sham. They're misupak. They're not clear. They're in doubt whether if you pledge to one ani, you said, I pledge I'm going to give ploni the ani tzedakah, I'm going to give Ruvain ploni the tzedakah. Are you allowed to change your mind and say, I've decided I don't like Ruvain very much. I'm going to give the money to Shimon the ani instead. It's a suffix in their minds. V'nira kaven diyachol l'shanoto l'mitzvah acheres. V'chamoshe kasvu toisus perakama de'erichin davav. Divrei hamaschal ad shelo bali yad gabai b'shem harav Rabbeinu Baruch. He says, according to the first answer in Tosfos, not only are you allowed to change from one ani tzedakah to another ani tzedakah, but you're allowed to change from one mitzvah to a completely different mitzvah. Dim nadar tzedakah laniyim yachol lasos mitzvah acheres ayin sham v'im kein niraduhu adin b'noder leploni ani kaven delo amrina namira legavoa b'tzedakah laniyim ve'enu ela mishum neder v'chsiv b'ficha tzedakah v'sagi le'litno la'ani acher. So the Ktsos' argument is as follows. When you make a pledge for tzedakah, it's not like amira legavoa kimisiraso lehejot, like it is when you pledge an animal, right, for a korban, right? It's all you're doing is obligating yourself. You've generated a debt for yourself. And since all you've done when you make a pledge for tzedakah is generated a debt to give to charity, you are still the balabas over which charity you would like to donate to. And if it's true that you can change from giving it from an ani to doing a completely other mitzvah, then it stands to reason that according to this Rabbeinu Baruch, you're allowed to change from one ani to a different ani. Let's say, and this could theoretically happen all the time, two mishulachim come to your door and they're collecting tzedakah. And then you start pulling out money from your pocket, and the first meshulach is obnoxious, and he says that's not enough. And you decide, okay, it never happens in real life. I'm just creating a hypothetical. You could say, you know what? I've changed my mind. I'm giving this to your chaver who came to the door at the same time with you, sei gesund, and close the door. So according to the first answer in the Ktsos, that would be perfectly permissible. Mihu, however, midivrei hagos maimoni nira de'eno yochel litno la'acher. There is a commentary to the Rambam called the Hagos Maimoni, and it seems from his statement that you would not be allowed to change it to a different ani. Ayin Sham Perak Yud Aleph, Mizechia zelushono. Pasak mori rabbeinu zatzal al ish ve'ishto shehisnu b'neihem b'kinyan. The Hagos Maimoni, who's a Rishon, gives the following case. There was a husband and a wife who had made a pact between them using a kinyan and using a shtar. In other words, they really indebted themselves legally. Laseis kach bekach likrovehem. That when they die, we want certain amount of funds to go, or actually not when they die. They said, we're going to give, we have, Baruch Hashem, we've been blessed with money. We have relatives who are not as fortunate as we are. We're each going to support you, wife, you will give 50,000 to your relatives, to your cousins and nieces and nephews. And we'll take a 50,000 and we'll give it to my nieces and nephews and cousins. Okay, beautiful. But umeis echad. But then one of the spouses passed away. So let's say the husband passed away. The wife now comes along and says, now I have this $100,000. We were going to give 50,000 of it to my husband's relatives, but they mean nothing to me. So I would like to give all 100,000 to my relatives, and I have nothing to do with my husband's relatives. So he says, She'ein hasheni yochol lishanos milases mechza lekrove hames. That doesn't work. You don't, the Hagos Maimoni says, based on a psak that he was recording here, you do not have permission to do that. Kaven shelo hiskiru shum adam elastam likrovehem, zachu krov of b'mechza, ukroveha b'mechza, v'nasa neder. This becomes, in other words, when the husband and wife made this written agreement between themselves, it became a legally binding pledge that 50% of the 100 grand, let's say, would go to the husband's relatives and 50% would go to the wife's relatives. The efshir lishanos, and you don't have a right to change and say, now take all 100 of it and give it to her relatives because she has no shaychus at all to the deceased husband's relatives. And here, Adarabba, we're saying that once you made the pledge, you committed yourself to God to fulfill what you are doing, to fulfill that mitzvah. And he says, just to illustrate, if I made a pledge to tzedakah, I put aside money that I said I was going to give to the poor. Would I have the right now to give that as a gift to a person who's not poor? Of course not. And therefore, the same is true if I want to change from one ani to another. So the Hagos Maimoni is seemingly siding with the second answer of Tosfos, contra the first answer of Tosfos. The efshir the svira leila Hagos Maimoni damira legavo amrina nami bamira laani davi kinyan mamish kmo bamira lahektish. And it could be that the Hagos Maimoni paskins that just like when you make a declaration of something being hektish, it immediately belongs to the temple. So too, making a declaration that this is for aniyim means it automatically is gifted to the aniyim. And he says that's an algemeiner machloikes. V'hadvarim atikim v'ayin beis Yosef b'yoredeis min reish nuches v'imkein vaday ein lashanos me'ani la'ani. And therefore, according to that opinion, you cannot change from one poor person to another. Aval lefi das rov haposkim damira la'ani eino kinyan ela mishum neder yachalu l'shanosa la'ani acher. However, that would be the minority opinion. Paskins the ksuns. He says, in my opinion, since when you make a pledge to the poor, it is not considered to be like making a declaration of hektish. You are allowed to change your pledge from one ani to another. And in the case of the Hagos Maimoni, I would disagree. And I would hold that the wife can actually decide to give all 100 to her family instead of giving half of it to the husband's family. Now, yes, Shmuel.
I want to give the other on the wife decided she wanted to give half to the relatives and she died. She's not making a decision anymore on the half that she wanted to give to the relatives. The husband is making a decision on what she wanted.
Yeah, but it's presumably now all of the assets belong to her. It's her money now.
Person died, lost control.
Yeah, right. Once a person is dead, there is an inyan of mitzvah l'kayim divrei hames, right? But that's not mi'ikr hadin. It's lifnim mishuras hadin. So we might want to encourage the wife who inherited her husband. You know that old joke about, he said, "Buy me a nice stone." So she goes ahead and she buys herself a $25,000 diamond because the husband wanted her to buy a nice stone, right? The truth is, once the spouse is deceased, the inheriting spouse can do whatever they want with the money. Only because of mitzvah l'kayim divrei hames. That's the whole issue. The whole issue is that, and that's the reason when we learned Hilchos Nachala, we learned all of these issues about how to make the will legally binding, even when the will goes against the rules of Nachala according to the Torah. Okay, so it's not so clear cut that you have to follow the will. We've had cases where a decedent divided his estate among 3 heirs, 2 boys and a girl, or actually 1 boy and 2 girls, and my estate is going to all 3 of my kids 30, 30, 30, right? And we've had cases even in this community, well, not even in the Toronto Jewish community, there have been cases that have been documented where the son came forward and said, I'm entitled to all 100% of the estate because daughters do not inherit. B'makom aben, when there's a son. How you circumvent that issue is a whole discussion into itself. But here you do see a machlokes among the poskim. Do we say when a person pledges to tzedakah that it's like a pledge to hektish, and therefore it's legally binding without any wiggle room whatsoever? Or do we say, and that seems to be like the second opinion of Tosfos, or do we say that making a pledge to tzedakah for aniyim is not like making a pledge to hektish, and therefore it's a neder? It's like it has the din of a neder, but it's not a neder to hektish, and you have to fulfill your obligation to do a mitzvah, the mitzvah fulfilling your neder, but you do have wiggle room to change from one mitzvah to another. Eddie. No, you see, once you make the idea of a neder, right? The only time that there's this issue of notification, there are a number of permutations of where notification is relevant. Remember, I told you that halacha before, that if a person makes a pledge to tzedakah, there's no you're obligated to pay it as long as the need is clear and present and immediate, right? If no one knows you made the pledge, the Shulchan Aruch paskins, you must notify the Gabbai Tzedakah of your pledge because you have an obligation to honor it immediately. So it doesn't really matter whether the recipient is aware of the pledge or not. You made a neder. You have to fulfill the neder. Now, I just want to let you know, I'm happy to discuss whatever you'd like, but at some point we're going to lose out because we won't be able to see the real life tshuvas. But go ahead.
I'll make it quick. If you mix it back in.
It could be. That would be like that. Like that would be another scenario where what happens if the pledge was made under false pretenses. So, for example, I made a pledge to what I thought was an orphanage, but it turns out the father's not dead. Okay. In other words, but he said they were in financial straits and they recovered from their financial straits and now they don't need the money anymore. So it could be that since the neder was only made was contingent upon them being aniyim, they no longer are aniyim, it could be that I don't have to fulfill that pledge. But I want to point out, but it could be that I would still be obligated to use that money for a different tzedakah. I'm not sure. I really don't know. It's a good question. Okay. The Mishnah Berurah, interestingly, in Hilchos Purim, actually discusses this issue in brief. Just take a look at the Mishnah Berurah. He says, Kosav Beis Yosef b'shem Hagos Ashri. And I think that he's referring to the same Beis Yosef that the Ktsos was referring. He says, Dema'os shechoshav belibo lechalkam la'aniyim biyom Purim, that if you had in mind that you were setting aside and even meant a mental designation, right? That you said, I'm going to give $100 for matanos la'aniyim over Purim. And for whatever reason, you got distracted and you ended up not giving the money and you want to now change it for something else. Eno rashai l'shanosa. You're not allowed to change it, to give it to for some other cause. Bahatam disvirale, and the reason is because the Beis Yosef is of the opinion, Tzedaka yeshlo din hektish, v'chayev l'kayim machashavto af shelo hotzi bisvasa. Like the Ktsos says, the Ktsos actually argues that Rov Poskim do not hold that way, but the Mishnah Berurah is not going, according to the Ktsos, is not going like Rov Poskim. I just find that fascinating that the Mishnah Berurah is being machmir like the Beis Yosef, even though, what? All right, what I don't know. As far as this, I don't know why he chose to be machmir, but that seems to be the generally accepted psak. When I was growing up, that's all we learned was Mishnah Berurah, and so it is interesting that the Ktsos says we don't go like that, and the Mishnah Berurah says we do. Anyway. Right. But on Purim, we don't check. I don't think that, I hear what you're saying, Laser, but I don't think that I think this is in the abstract, because the Beis Yosef that he's quoting, I don't think is dafka on Purim. I think it's just that he says you're not allowed to change. Okay. Shach, Yoredeya Siman Reish Nun Vav says, and this is in the middle of coming into a totally different discussion, but he says, Nira de'im lakcho bi'ir zu mitzvos o galilo chedoima lahem chayavim litein le'ir zu. So he says, if a person purchased an aliyah, a kavod, hagba galila, some shul sell those kibudim, and the person now says, I don't have anything to do with this shul. Yes, I pledged I'd give $36 for the kibbud, but I'll give it to my shul when I get back to my town. Is he allowed to do that? So, Craig, what do you say, the president of the Bayit?
I would give the money on the spot right after Shabbos.
No, it's Shabbos. Okay.
Right after Shabbos.
Yeah.
Give it to your balavai wherever you stay.
Okay, so he says you're not. He says ein yacholim lachzor b'likcham lahavim leiram. He says you're not allowed to take that money and bring it back home with you and give it to your own city. Dehakanu mitzvos beveis hakneses zu. So first of all, it's because there's been a quid pro quo. The shul has provided you with goods or services, and it was on that basis that you were giving them something for those goods or services that they gave you that kibbud, right? So you don't have a right now to say, well, I'll fulfill my mitzvah tzedakah by giving it to my shul. That's number one. Va'od she'im lo kain tehei pseida litzdaka zu shahayu anshe osa ha'ir kona mitzvah zu v'chein noagin. And furthermore, you've also created an out-of-pocket expense for the shul where you got the kibbud. Why? Because if you had not purchased the aliyah, somebody else would have and given the money to the shul. Right? So that compounds it's the problematic issue, and it's even doubly worse. Okay. I think it would make a huge difference. It would make a huge difference, right? Because if you make the pledge afterwards, because you want to show your hakara satov, there was no obligation at all for you to get for you to buy the aliyah. But the shul, after you got your aliyah, they gave you a card, and they said if you'd like to donate, scan this QR code, which by the way we're in the process of doing. By the way, we're going to be printing up cards at the Bayit. And you'll be able to, like a guest who comes for Shabbos, will be able to just hold this little card, hold his phone over the QR code, and we'll be able to go. They'll take him right away to the Bayit website for the donation. Like we're trying to get into the 21st century finally, So we're not obligating a person to, but of course, then the question becomes back to Tosfos, back to the Ktsos HaChosh. Okay. Notice the Mabit says the same thing. I looked up the Mabit, I couldn't find it. Okay. But of course, maybe if I would have spent more time, I would have eventually found it, but it's not where the Shach says it is. Comes along Rav Fisher, Rav Yisrael Yaakov Fisher Zatzal, who was a dayan on the Badatz, passed away about 10 years ago, I believe. Sorry, 20 years ago, excuse me, around 2003, 2000, I don't remember exactly. And he's got two tshuvas on this subject. He says, Mashashol malas kvodo, shenadav livnos li yeshiva beis oitzar asforim. He says a person made a nedava, made a pledge, and that he was going to build for Yeshiva X, he was going to build them a library, an oitzar sfarim, separate room that is stocked with sfarim. Uchvar nasan chelek misikum habeniya. He's already started making payments. So they paid the contractor and they've already started the construction. And they got into some kind of fight. He claims that the menahel of the yeshiva insulted him or caused him mental anguish. Maybe he went to daven there for Shabbos and they only gave him shlishi. They didn't give him shishi. Or vice versa, depending upon your narrative, okay? And he's very insulted, he's very belidic, he's very bent out of shape. And now, Eino Rotza od lases lahashlim ligmar habiniya. And now he doesn't want to pay the balance that he owes to the yeshiva for the Oitzar Sfarim. Ela Rotza litain laotzar hasfarim b'yeshiva acheres. And now he wants to build another Oitzar Sfarim in a different yeshiva where they give me real covered. Okay, the kind that I'm not a covered mensch, of course, chas v'shalom, I'm not a covered mensch, but they only gave me shlishi. Right? But anyway, I digress, of course. But so he wants to. So again, he's going to put all the plaques in another yeshiva, and he wants to take the money that he had pledged for this yeshiva to give it to a different yeshiva. The gam. And furthermore, do I need a hataras nedarim? I made a neder that I was going to give it to one yeshiva. Do I need a hataras nedarim? If the answer is I'm allowed to do this. This is his knech. This is his kvetch, right? He says, had I known that I would be so disrespected by yeshiva X, I never would have pledged in the first place to them. Okay, v'gam zolel mikri noilad, hishchichi inshi delo malu umitzarim acherim. He says, and furthermore, he says zelo mikri nolad. He says this is not like a new situation, that because there are unsavory people who cause anguish to others all the time. It's not like this is a new menahel who came about. It's the same menahel. And he was there all the time, but he was obsequious until he knew that he had my pledge. I think that's what he means by this last line. I'm not sure if I've translated it correctly, but he says, Hineni mishivo. So here's my response. So first he starts off by quoting Tosfos and Erechim. Tosfos be'erechim daf vav amid beis b'shem Rabbeinu Baruch v'chein das harosh perakama de perakama. I'm not sure what this abbreviation is. Da'ad shelo ba lidei gaba yochol l'shanosa. That the Rosh paskins like Rabbeinu Baruch, that you're allowed to change the money for a different tzedakah cause, as long as it hasn't yet reached the hands of the Gabbai tzedakah. V'hacha harei af shechela kfar natan harei eino dan al zeh. He says, even though you want to argue that he's already made partial payments to Yeshiva X, and now he wants to give it to Yeshiva Y, he's not demanding to get the money back that he gave. He just doesn't want to pay the balance. Okay? Ela almasha adain lo nasan va'ain ksos hachoshen simin reishiyud beis shekosov b'hai plugta indadav la'ani echad v'rotze l'shanos la'ani acher zetoli b'plugta diyochel l'shanos l'mitzvah acheres. He says again, the ksos, he quotes the ksos that we just saw. Who hadin diyochel l'shanos la'ani acher? He says, according to Rabbeinu Baruch, you are allowed to change from one ani to another, from one yeshiva to another. Imkain benidon didan diika Bay, the Ika Bays, Etzem HaYeshiva Shenoch, the Ika Bays. In other words, you have both aspects over here. You have Etzem HaYeshiva Shenodar Malas Kavodo Avura, V'chein La'elu Halomdim Ba. He says you have two aspects here. He says the argument that the other side is making is that the yeshiva needs it, and the bachurim that are learning in the yeshiva need those funds. But he says, but the truth is, he was never thinking about those specific bachurim who are learning in yeshiva X. He says, because the yeshiva has constant turnover. So his objective, his thinking was not about the bachurim who are learning in yeshiva X. His thinking was about having a plaque in Yeshiva X where you could say that I built that Oitzar Svarim. And therefore, the Vadai Yachol Lishano Soli Yeshiva Acheres. And therefore, he would be allowed to, says Rav Fisher, change the balance of his pledge to a different yeshiva. Ulam, which is, by the way, Craig, a cautionary tale. Once you get a donor, keep kissing him until he pays the balance. Okay? Ulam may. However, with all of that said, since there are poskim who disagree with Rabbeinu Baruch and disagree with the Ktsos, that once you made a pledge to Yeshiva X or cause X, you're not allowed to change it, Yoter Tov Shiyase HaToras Nedarim. At least get a HaToras Nedarim to address the opposing side. V'lo tzrichim lepesach ki ha'ikar deposchem b'charata kenifsak b'shulchan. And you don't have to come up with a specific argument that had I known, etc., because as we know, when we get Ataras Nedarim on Erev Rosh Hashanah, we don't ask the person, do you have charata? And you have to explicate what your charata is and on what basis. All you have to say is, do you have remorse having made the pledge? And as long as the person says, I regret having made the pledge, that's enough of a Pesach to do Ataras Nedarim. V'yoser tov l'daiti sheyomer shemitcharet rak al ma shelo amar b'li neder kidei shelo lakor es kol hamitzvah ma shenosan kvar. And it's better to say, I have regret that I didn't say b'li neder when I made the pledge, because in that way you'll still get rewarded for the tzedakah that you did give, because you're not expressing remorse on the tzedakah that you gave already, but you're just expressing remorse that you didn't say b'li neder on fulfilling the entirety of the pledge. And then look at this last line. Then look at the last line where he sort of upends everything he just said. Ulam ladaiti ot tzarich iyun. He says, we need to investigate this further. Diyesh lomar diika kan she'ela shel nekima unatira al ma shetzi aruhu. He says, I'm not so clear whether this is the right thing to do, because we might look at this as nekama, as taking revenge for them having caused you pain by not giving you shishi or whatever you were expecting, for having insulted you or whatever they did or didn't do that you were expecting. And when a person takes nekama and uses tzedakah money to take nekama, that's not right. That's not right, says Rav Fisher. You know, a person who's been supporting a tzedakah for years and then says, I'm belighted, I'm insulted because you didn't do this or you did this. That's not right to take nekama.
In this case, it's a large donor and they're building the library. There's potentially a downside financially.
Yeah, the institution is left holding the bags. They're going to have to find another donor. Let me also point out that Rav Fisher's point is the yeshiva is still a great yeshiva. The Oitzar Sfarim in Yeshiva X will be utilized by very fine yeshiva bachurim. This became personal between the donor and one of the menahalim and one of the directors, one of the fundraisers for the yeshiva. Now, what if a person made an adava to Yeshiva X because he was sold on the yeshiva by the executive director who came to Toronto and really convinced him we have an amazing yeshiva? He's started his donations and then he says, you know what, I'm going to Eretz Yisrael. Let me check out the yeshiva. And he finds out that the yeshiva is comprised of the executive director's nephews and a guy who's learning impaired and a couple of other guys who are on their cell phones, and it's not a serious place. Could the argument be made that it was a mekach tos, that this was not a pledge that I made on this basis? I thought this was a real yeshiva where B'nai Torah are learning b'hasmada yomam v'layla, and it was on that basis that I made my pledge. So I don't think that Rav Fisher would have that reservation, because I don't want to withhold my pledge because of any personal insult that was thrown at me, but rather because I want my tzedakah money to go to causes that where the utilization of that money will go to a maximally effective tzedakah. Okay.
Logic. We're going to go with the and therefore it would be permissible to think. But if we're going to be kosher for the other side, then we do have Taras Nidar. So does that open up the potential to say you can always just get out of it, just with Taras Nidar?
Right. You could make that argument, but a number of poskim say that you're not allowed to get a hataras nedarim on a tzedakah pledge. On a tzedakah pledge, because you could always rely on, like, make a pledge. The shul, you make a pledge of $100,000 to the shul, and then all of a sudden, Erev Rosh Hashanah rolls around. I don't have to give anymore. I got a hataras nedarim. Doesn't work. Doesn't work. Certainly not with a public pledge. So he's using it as a sneef, I think. I think he's using it as a sneef. In other words, if it weren't for the fact that Me'ikar Hadin, he paskins like Rabbeinu Baruch, he would not allow you to get a hataras nedarim. There are many other shilas, but unfortunately I have to finish. Maybe we'll continue this when I get back, but there's a second tshuva from Rav Fisher, where a person had pledged $5,000 to purchase the scrolls for the Haftorah for the shul. But now all of a sudden he discovers that there's a mikveh campaign in this, and he wants to change the money from the Haftorah scrolls to the mikveh because he views that as a more important mitzvah. That's another tshuva. We'll get to that next time. And then finally, we have a tshuva from Rav Weiss, the Minchas Yitzchak, who has the following shaila. A guy pledged money to move to a new shkuna, and they don't have a Beit HaKnesset yet, and he pledges to help build the Beit HaKnesset, and he's really excited and enthusiastic until the shul is actually built, and he hasn't fulfilled his complete pledge yet, but has made partial payment. And all of a sudden, again, Belidic, Machloikis, he doesn't like the shul, he doesn't like the way they're doing things. He was expecting a chair on the Mizrach Band and whatever it was, and he says, it's not her fault. he says, I'm moving out of the community. I'm not going to be benefiting from the shul anymore. I want to build another shul. And so I want to give the balance of my pledge to that other shul. Is he allowed to do that? Okay, not so pasha. What if he has a good taina that this shul that I thought they were building, I thought it was going to be a certain kind of davening. And they don't daven the way that I was expecting them to daven. I thought that they were going to be maybe a certain nusach or a certain way, and it's not coming out that way. So that's a longer tshuva. I think there's a lot more to discuss. We'll save it for later. Have a great night, everybody.